Hello everyone and welcome to this lesson. In this lesson we'll be reviewing Angular reactive forms, how to add cookies to a user's browser, and how to validate session cookies. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we want to change the assignment number. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the base layout.component.ts file. Inside this we want to update the this.assignment to exercise 7.2 reactive forms. Once we updated that, we want to go ahead and install the npm package ngx cookies service. Okay, now that that's installed, we need to generate a new guard for the sign in. Then we also need to generate a service for sign in, and then we're going to generate a component for sign in. And then for the guard, we just want to select the can activate. Okay, once those have been actually added to the application, we can go ahead and close out the terminal window, and then we want to open up our routing file. So inside our routing file, we actually want to add a can activate for the base layout component. And the reason why is that so we want to force users to log into our system before they can access the base component. So in anything underneath the child array for the base component, we want them to have a login access to be able to get access to those components. So right after the child array, we just want to add a comma, and then there is where we're going to call the can activate. And then we're just going to say sign in guard. We will need to import over the sign in guard as well as the sign in component. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, and the only other thing we need to do is add a route for our sign-in component. So underneath the childs of the session, so underneath our auth layout component, we want to go ahead and add another path, and that one's going to be for the sign-in component. Okay, with those in place, what we want to do now is just go ahead and run an ng build. And really we're just doing this just to test to make sure that nothing is broken in our application and we have no errors. So I'm going to open up a new terminal window. And I'm just going to say ng build. All right, now that we verify that there are no errors after running ng build, we can go ahead and close down the terminal window. And now what we want to do is we want to open up the app.module.ts file. So in the app.module.ts file, we actually need to add an import statement for the cookie service. And then once we do that, we just need to add it to our imports array. So I'm going to say import. And this is going to be from the ngx cookie service package. Now we also need to import over the forms module and the reactive forms module from Angular's forms library. We can remove the other entry that we already had for just the forms module. And this is where we need to add those items to our imports array. So down below, we'll just go ahead and add 2 new entries, and those are going to be for the reactive forms module and the forms module. We can go ahead and save it. Next, we want to go ahead and open up our sign-in service. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the other tab windows. And inside our service, what we actually want to do is we want to create a function called validate that's going to accept in a numerical value, and then it's going to return a true or false value based on whether or not the ID that we pass in matches some IDs in an array that we're going to create. So we're going to create a class member, and that class member is going to be called student IDs, and it's going to be an array of numbers. In the constructor of the student ID and the constructor of the sign-in service, we're going to populate the student IDs array with pre-default values of 1007 through 1012. So I'm going to say this dot student IDs equals an opening closing bracket, and then I'm just going to pass in those values. So 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, and then 1012. These actually are going to be the student IDs that we're going to allow for users entering into our sign-in component to access our application. So underneath the constructor, we're going to create a new function, and that's going to be called validate. And then inside the parameters for the validate function, we want to accept one parameter of value type number. So we're going to say student ID, and that's going to be numerical value type. In the body of this function, what we want to do is we want to return true if we find a matching value or a matching entry inside our student IDs array. So this array that we just populate inside the constructor, what we want to do is we want to search for the number that's being passed in and return true if we find that number and false if we do not. Fortunately, there is a built-in function we can use called .sum, which allows us to basically search over that array and return true or false based on if anything matches, so an equality of true. So I'm just going to say return this dot student IDs dot sum, and then I'm just going to say ID, and then we're just going to say ID equals student ID. So again, by using this .sum, it returns a true or false value, and that's all we want to do is we just want to make sure that when I pass in a student ID value, it matches one of the entries inside the student IDs array that we have. So I can go ahead and save this, and they can close out this file. Now let's go ahead and open up the base.component.ts file. We actually want to create a new function in here called sign out so that once a user logs into our system, we want to have a link in the top navigation bar that allows a user to sign out of the application. So I'm just going to create a new function called sign out. And then inside this, we're actually going to call the cookie service to delete all of the entries inside of our browser. So the NGX cookie service is actually a service that allows us to add cookies to a browser. So if we want to remove cookies, we just need to call the delete all function. So the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to actually add a reference inside the constructor for the cookie service. So I'm going to say private cookie service, and that's going to be of type cookie service. I also want to import over the router, so I'm going to say private router and then router. Now you will notice that you're going to have red squiggly lines, which means there's errors, and that just means we have to import over those items into this component. So we'll say import cookie service, and that is coming from our NGX cookie service, and then the next one is going to be router. And that's going to be coming from our Angular/router package. Okay, with those two packages imported over, now we can go ahead and start writing the code out for our sign out component. So we're going to say this.cookieService, and we just want to say delete all. And then we're going to say this.router.navigate. So once a user selects the sign out option inside of our navigation bar, we actually want to take them back to the sign in screen. So we're going to say this.router.navigate. We're going to pass in the route to the sign in component. So we're going to say /session/sign in. And then we're just going to save it. With our TypeScript code in place, we can go ahead and open up the HTML file from the base layout and actually add that link into our navigation bar. So I'm just going to close out the TypeScript file, and then we'll just leave the HTML file open. And like I said, we want to add a new button inside the navigation bar for our sign out function we just created. So underneath the home button, we're going to create a new button, and we're just going to say button, mat button. We're going to give it a click event. And this click event is just going to call our sign out function that we just created from the TypeScript code. And then as far as our value goes, we're just going to say sign out. And then we're just going to hit save. Once we're done with that, we can go ahead and start implementing our sign in guard. So let's go ahead and close out this tab, and then we'll go down and we'll find our sign in guard. And then as you can see from here, there's this statement that says return true. And hopefully, as everyone remembers from previous exercises, the can activate has to return a true or false value. So we're just going to go ahead and remove this code here. We need to create a constructor. Inside that constructor, we actually want to import over our cookie service and our router. And so we'll say constructor. And then inside the parentheses, we want to have one for the router and then one for cookie service. So we're going to say private router. And then we want to say private cookie service of type cookie service. And again, same thing, we're going to need to import over those libraries. So we'll import over the router one. And that is from Angular, that is at Angular/router. And then we need to import over the cookie service. And that is going to be from our NGX cookie service package that we installed. Okay, with those in place, in the body of our can activate function, we actually want to grab the session user. So what we want to do is we want to call the cookie service, and we want to say .get. So we actually want to find the cookie that we're going to be adding to the browser once a user signs into the application. Now, I know we haven't created that code yet, but basically we're going to create a variable called session_user, and then we're going to use the .get to be able to retrieve that cookie from the user's browser. So I'm going to say constant, and then I'm just going to say session user equals, and then we'll say this.cookieService.get, and then again, we just want to call this variable called session user. Underneath that, what we want to do is we want to create an if statement to check whether or not there's actually something being returned from the session user. So when I call this.cookieService.get and I pass in session_user, I want to just verify there's something there. And if there's something there, that means it's going to tell us that yes, we actually have a user logged in to our system. So we're going to say if session user, we want to return true. And then we're going to have an else statement. And an else statement is basically going to say, so if the session user, if that variable is nothing, so in other words, it's null or it's not, or it's nan, then what we want to do is we want to re-navigate users back to the sign-in component because they don't have access to our application. So we're going to say this.router.navigate. And then we're just going to say /session/sign in. Now, if you remember, since it's a can activate route, we actually need to pass in a true or false value, or what's going to happen is that when they click on a link, it's going to fail. It's never going to get to this. It's never going to route actually to this login screen unless we return false. So we're going to say return false. And all we need to do now is just save it. Okay, with that in place, the only last thing that we need to do is we need to open up our sign-in component, work on the TypeScript code, the HTML code, and then add some styling to it. So the first thing we always want to do is we always want to start with our actual TypeScript code. So I'm going to close out this tab. We're going to open up our sign-in component, and we're going to find the TypeScript file. Inside the TypeScript file, we're actually going to be using reactive forms. Now, if you remember from previous exercises, we were actually using template-driven forms, but for this exercise, we're going to be using reactive forms. One of the advantages that I like about using reactive forms is we have the ability to have more control over how we populate and how we access the values inside the form. Plus, Angular provides a lot of built-in validation functions that are easy to implement inside of reactive forms. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I want to create two class fields. Those class fields are going to be called sign-in form of type form group, and then we're going to have one called error message of type string. So I'm going to say sign-in form. This is going to be a form group. And then I'm going to have one called error message. And that's going to be of type string. Inside the constructor's parameters, we actually want to pass in the router, the cookie service, as well as we want to pass in our form builder and sign-in service. So I'm going to say private router. That's going to be of type router. Then I'm going to say private cookie service of type cookie service. Private FB of type form builder. And then I'm going to say private sign-in service, and this is going to be of type sign-in service. Now again, you are going to see a lot of red squiggly lines is because we haven't imported over those packages yet, so let's go ahead and do that now. We need to import over the sign-in service. We need to import over the router. We also need to import over the form builder and form group. And those are going to be coming from the Angular/forms. So at Angular/forms. And then we need to import over the cookie service, which is coming from the NGX cookie service package. And just make sure that you spell form group and form builder. Everything is spelled correctly, and if there's any underscore red squiggly lines, just make sure you address those before you go too far in the application. So in this case, it was misspelled, so we just want to type in form group, and then we'll just make sure we save it. Okay, so in our onInitialization function, we actually want to start building out our form group. So we're going to build out the sign-in form. So what we're going to say is we're going to say this dot sign-in form dot, and actually we want to say equals this dot FB, so form builder dot group. And so what we're doing is we're creating a new Angular form that we're going to be using, and this is the premise of how you create reactive forms. So inside the body, we're just going to say student ID, so that's going to be the field that we're looking for, and then we're just going to leave it as an empty value. So we're going to say this.signInForm equals this.fb.group. FB represents the form builder that we passed inside our constructor. And then .group just means that we're using the builder to build a group of items, and those items are going to be how we're going to bind data inside the form. Underneath that, we want to have an onSubmit event, and so this is what happens once a user clicks submit. That's what we want to do. We want to capture that value, and then we want to call our service. So we're going to say onSubmit. What we want to do is we want to capture the form value. So I'm going to say constant form values equals this.signInForm.value. So this line that we just created, line 26, constant form values equals this.signInForm.value is how we capture the values from the form. Underneath that, we want to have one called student ID, and this variable is going to hold the student ID value. So I'm going to say constant student ID equals, then we want to say parse int, because remember, we want this to be a numerical value, and we're going to say form values dot student ID. Now, hopefully you can kind of see a trend here. When I'm saying parse int, I'm parsing over a string value to an integer value, but when I say form values, it's this constant we created right above it, and I'm saying student ID. Student ID represents the actual control inside our form group. So this is just an example, so don't try this in your app, but if I said, let's call something like name, open and closing a quote, I would access that value the same way, right? I would say constant name equals, and then I would just say form values dot name. So once I pull out all the values of the form, I can actually access the individual components of that form. And as long as you just have to make sure they match the items that you're passing into the form group. So I'm just going to remove the name because we don't need that for this exercise. Now inside of our onSubmit, what we want to do is we want to check, we want to call the sign-in service, and we just want to check to make sure that the student ID value that we get from the sign-in form is actually a valid value. And if you remember, we created that function called validate. So we want to say if, and then we just want to say this.signInService dot validate. And this is where we're going to pass in the student ID that we just collected from the form. And so if you remember, it returned a true or false value. So if true, then we want to say this.cookieService.set. So this is how we set the cookie inside the browser. And if you remember, we called our variable session user. So I'm going to say session user. And the second thing that this set function takes is going to be the actual data that we want to pass in. So the first one is going to be the key. So how do we access that value by its name? And then the second part is going to be the actual value. So in this case, we're going to say student.toString, and just make sure it's actually student ID because it's that captured value that we just had. And then we're just going to say comma 1. So we say this.cookieService.set session user is the name of the actual cookie that we want to set, and then student ID.toString just means that we're going to be making this a string value once we set it inside of our cookie service. Next thing we want to do is that we want to route them back to our home screen. So we're going to say this.router.navigate. And we can go and just allow them access to the main components, or our slash, our root value, our root path of our application. And then we want to have an else statement, and inside our else statement is we want to handle if the ID that's being passed in does not match. So in other words, if it's not a valid student ID, we need to do something with it. And in this case, we just want to populate an error message that lets the user know that the ID they've entered in is an incorrect ID. So I'm going to say this.error message equals, and this is where I'm just going to leave a custom message. So I'm going to say the student ID you entered is invalid. Please try again. So we'll say the student ID you entered is invalid. Please try again. Okay, with our type scope created, all we need to do now is just move over to our HTML code and implement the actual form itself. So I'm going to close out the TypeScript code, and then I'm going to open up the signin.component.html file. We can go ahead and remove the paragraph tag that we had there. And then what we want to do is we want to create an FX column. So I'm going to say div FX layout, and this is going to be a column. Inside here, we're actually going to have a mat card. So we're going to say mat card. And one thing that I found out is that if you wrap the cards with inside of a div, you actually get better functionality for the FX layout. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say FX flex. And then inside this div, we'll have this mat card. And again, what I found out is that if I put the card, Angular's cards, inside of a parent div, then the FX flex works a lot better than it does if I put it as, so instead of doing FX flex on the card itself, if I do it in a div above it, for whatever reason, the FX layout works better and you run into less errors when you're trying to manipulate different size layouts for different screen sizes that you may have for your users. So as we know, inside of a card, you're always going to have a title and you're going to have content, right? So we're going to have a mat card title. In this case, we want to have a subtitle, so we're going to say mat card subtitle. And then we're going to have a mat card content. I like to always create everything that I'm going to need for the card ahead of time so that I don't make any mistakes and I don't forget about the different sections of the card that I want to use. So for the card itself, we just want to add a class to it because we don't want there to be any elevation. So we're going to say mat elevation Z8. And so actually what we want is we want to actually just show some elevation on this. So we're going to say ELEVATION. And then it's going to say Z8. We're also going to give this a class of sign-in container, and we will create the sign-in container in just a second. But it's basically we want to have this so we can control the width of the actual sign-in form that we're creating. So once we have those items in place, we can go ahead and start working on our title. So for our title, we're just going to say student sign in. And then under our subtitle, we're just going to say you must enter a valid student ID to proceed. So we'll say student ID to proceed. Under the card content, we want to create a new div, and this is going to be called a class of message error. And again, we'll create this class in just a second. And then we want to have an ngIf directive. And basically what we're trying to do is we want to check to see if that error message variable we created in the TypeScript code has any string value associated with it. So we're going to say if error message. Then we just really want to output that error message. So we're just going to say error message. Inside our content, we also want to add a new mat card, and this mat card is going to be for the actual form field. So we're going to say mat card class. We're going to give this one no elevation. We're going to say FX layout column. And we're going to say FX layout gap. And we're going to say 10 pixels. So again, this second card is going to represent the form. So and this is just going to be a way for us to organize our form so that our form can have all the fields and the labels and everything is organized. That looks good. So inside this, we need to create a form. So we're going to say form, and then inside the form is where we're going to have our mat content. Our form is going to need a form group. So we're going to say form group. And then the form group is going to be called sign in form. Now, if you remember from our TypeScript code, which I'll open up now, we created this form group called sign in form. So that's what we're referencing inside this form that we've just created. We say form group. We're referencing that sign in form that we created inside the TypeScript code. We also want to have an ng submit. And this is going to be when a user submits their form, we're going to call some function. And in our case, we created a function in the TypeScript code called onSubmit. So we're going to say onSubmit. Now, once the form is submitted, what I always typically try to do is I try to reset the form. So if I say signin.reset, basically when a user submits the form, all the field values will be cleared out. So again, make sure that you're referencing the actual form group that you created in the TypeScript code by its name. OnSubmit, again, was just that function that we created back in our TypeScript code that handles adding a cookie to the user's browser and then validating whether or not it's an actual ID as a valid ID, or it assigns a string value to the error message. So once we have our form set up correctly, inside our content, we can actually start building out our mat form field values. So we say mat form field, fx flex, and then we'll give this an appearance of fill. Inside this form field, we're going to have a mat label. And this is going to go for the text student ID. And we're going to give it an ID of label student ID. And the value is just going to be student ID. Underneath it, we need to create an input. That input type is going to be of text. It's going to be a mat input. We want to say form control name. And this is where we're going to reference the student ID form control that we created. And then we're going to give it an ID of text student ID. And then we're just going to give it a name of text student ID. Now, the form control name, this is a new directive, and it's referencing the student ID, right? Inside that TypeScript code that we just created, we have in the body of our form group, our sign-in form, we had this field called student ID. So we're telling Angular that the form control name, so where we want to map the values, is going to be to this form control called student ID, which again, we created inside our sign-in form group. Underneath the form field and underneath the content, we actually want to create an action so that we can handle the form submission. And so I like to use the mat card actions. And all we can do is we can say a line end, we can say a line start. In this case, we're just going to leave it as it is, but I'm going to create the button, and this button is going to be for submission. So we're going to say type submit, fx flex, and then mat raised button. We want to give it a color of primary. And then for the value, we're just going to say submit. We'll go ahead and save this. Now let's go and open up our CSS file and add our CSS code to give it some styling. So we'll open up the signin.component.css file. Let's go ahead and close out the other tabs that we have open. Now what we want to do is we're going to create a sign-in container class. Inside this one, we want to give it a width, and we're going to say 35%. We're going to say margin 15%, and then we're going to say auto. Next, we're going to create a class called message error. This message error is going to be what's displayed to the user once that error message variable that we added inside of our TypeScript code has a string value. So we're going to say margin, and we're going to do 10 pixels and then 0. Then we're also going to have a padding of 12 pixels. We'll give it a color. And then we're going to give it a background color. Okay. Now we also want to we actually want to add some text center alignment for the mat card title and the mat card subtitle. So I'm just going to say sign in container. And we just need to make sure your class says sign in container, because that's how we named it inside of our HTML code. Then we're going to have a greater than sign. We're going to say mat card title, and then we just want to have a comma, and then we're going to say mat card subtitle. So any mat card titles or subtitles underneath a child of the sign-in container, we want to apply specific styling to it. And we're just going to say text align, and then we're going to say center. And then we'll click save. So we can go to File, Save, or we can press Control S. And normally I just press Control S. We'll go ahead and open up a terminal window. We'll say New Terminal. And then we just want to run this application and then check out and see the results. So we're going to say ng serve. Okay, looks like there were no errors. So let's go and open up a browser window and navigate to localhost 4200 and see our results. So I'm just going to refresh the screen. And as you can see, we do have our sign-in screen once we refresh the screen, which makes sense because we added that our sign-in component and a sign-in guard. But you will notice that our styling doesn't look right. So let's go back over to our Visual Studio Code editor, and let's open up the HTML file, and just to make sure that we actually called the correct sign-in container. And as you can see, I'm referencing sign-in-container, but the CSS class that we created was called sign-in-container. So let's just fix that. Save it. Let's go back over to our browser and refresh the screen. And as you can see, it looks like that's a lot better. So we have our title, which says student sign in. We have a subtitle that says you must enter a valid student ID to proceed. Then we have our form field, and then we have a submit button. So let's go ahead and try to, just to make sure that everything is working correctly, let's remove the session/sign in, and let's just see if it actually takes us back to the sign in screen. And it looks like it does. Okay, so that works correctly. So let's go ahead and enter in an invalid ID and see what happens. So I'm just going to say ASDF, and I'm going to click Submit. And as you can see, we do have an error message that pops up, says the student ID you entered is invalid. Please try again. Okay, so let's go ahead and enter in a valid student ID. And so if you remember, it's 1007 through 101012. So 1012. So we'll say 1007. And then we'll click Submit. And we can see our GPA calculator application. So if I click the Sign Out button, it should take me back to the Sign In screen. So I'm going to press Sign Out, and it takes me back to the Sign In screen. So like I said, I always like to verify all of the values just to make sure that all of the student IDs are working correctly and that I've done the best I can to test the application. So I'm just going to try the rest of the numbers. So I'm going to say 1008, and I'm going to click the Enter button. Yep, that one works correctly. I'm going to do 1009. Looks like 1009 works correctly. I'm going to do 1010. 1010 works correctly. 1011. Yep, looks like that one works correctly. And then I'm going to try 1012. And it looks like 1012 works correctly. And just to prove that we do have validation in place, I'm going to type in 1013, and I'm going to press enter. And again, we get the error message that says the student ID you entered is invalid. So it looks like everything in our application is working correctly. To recap, in this lesson we reviewed Angular reactive forms, how to add cookies to a user's browser, and how to validate session cookies. In our next lesson, we'll review more reactive forms and form data validation. Thank you for watching.